Do you have much trouble separating Dan Blocker from Horst Cartwright? Well, not anymore. There was a time, of course, that I did. I think after, why are you listening to me? I don't care what you do once this thing's over with. You can lay down and die and rot in the street. At age 66, Dirk Blocker finally said the one thing no one ever expected a son would have to say about his father. My father didn't die from post-operative complications. He died because of Hollywood and fame. A confession that sent chills down even the most devoted Bonanza fans. It turns out that while America adored Hoss Cartwright, inside the Blocker family, fame was what took away a husband, a father, and the childhood of 4 children. Dirk admitted he once believed he had lost his father long before he actually died. Lost him to days when he was constantly exhausted on set, to trips where fans smothered him, to 14-hour shooting schedules that left him nothing but a shadow stepping into a home where 4 children were growing up. That is why Dirk stayed silent for 53 years, and that is why his confession today forces us to reconsider. Was the legend of Hoss Cartwright a success or the greatest tragedy of Dan Blocker's life? From that startling truth, the story begins, and every answer lies in the video. The world loved Hoss Cartwright, but I grew up with Dan Blocker, a completely different person. When Americans talk about Bonanza, they remember a giant of a man with a gentle smile like the late afternoon sun of the West, Hoss Cartwright. To them, Hoss embodied kindness, a gentle giant with a heart even bigger than his broad shoulders, someone whose mere presence warmed the audience. Hoss was the friend everyone wanted, the brother everyone wished for, the hero who never needed to brag yet was adored worldwide. Hoss was a symbol, but to his son, Dirk Blocker, Hoss was just a role. And because of that role, young Dirk needed many years to truly understand the man who raised him. Dirk once said something that left readers speechless. The world loved Hoss Cartwright, but I grew up with Dan Blocker. They shared the same face, the same voice, the same build, yet they belonged to 2 worlds as different as day and night. In public, his father was America's gentle giant. But in their small home, with no cameras, no performed smiles, no fake laughter after each line, Dirk saw another man, tired, quiet, and sometimes very sad. No one thought of this while watching Bonanza. No one imagined that Hoss, the symbol of safety, was created by someone who had lived through war, heard bullets whiz past his head, and held his friends as they took their last breaths. But Dirk knew. And that contrast created the greatest distance in his childhood. Dan Blocker had been a real soldier. He spent 209 days fighting in Korea through sub-zero nights, exploding artillery, cries for help, and the silence of those who never returned. He was wounded while rushing out to save a comrade, something Hollywood would later call a heroic act. But to Dan, it was a painful memory no one would want to revisit. Hoss Cartwright had no such darkness. Dan Blocker did, and he carried it for life. The Bonanza set made people forget that. They saw the gentle smile, the big belly, the warm personality, and believed that was the real Dan Blocker. They idolized the character so intensely that the real man faded within his own life. Everywhere he went, he was called Hoss, slapped on the back, greeted with cheerful remarks, as if he had no right to be sad, angry, or simply human. But Dirk saw the sides of his father that America never did. He saw him come home after 14-hour shoots, shirt drenched in sweat, legs heavy as stone. He saw him sit by the window for long stretches, silent, lost in memories no one else could enter. He saw sleepless nights, mornings where his father forced a smile for the children, trying to play the role of dad just as he played Hoss on set. To Dirk, growing up with his father meant learning to understand a man with 2 faces, not out of deceit, but because life demanded it. The real Dan Blocker was quiet, seasoned, deep, carrying invisible wounds. And Hoss Cartwright was the Hollywood-crafted version, cheerful, sunny, gentle as milk bread. Dirk never blamed his father. He simply said it took him many years to understand a simple truth. The real Dan Blocker was far more complex than the image the world preferred to believe. 2. My father was raised as a legend from the very first day, and had to live up to that legend. From the moment Dan Blocker was born, the world assigned him a title almost too big to believe. On December 10, 1928, in Bowie County, Texas, a nurse screamed in shock at the number on the scale, 14 pounds, a baby nearly twice the size of an average newborn. News spread like wildfire. The Blockers just had a baby the size of a sack of flour. People came to look. His mother was exhausted, and his father stood there, torn between worry and pride over the biggest baby in Bowie County. From that moment, the legend began, but not in a pretty way. Dan did not grow up as a child. He grew up as a story. When the family moved to O'Donnell, a town of barely 3,000 people, his name arrived before he did. Everyone said, "The Blocker boy, the giant." Dirk said, "My father spent his whole life carrying names he never chose. Big Dan, the Hercules of O'Donnell, the Texas giant." At 10, Dan weighed over 100 pounds. At 12, he was taller than most grown men in town. While other kids played marbles or jump rope, Dan was pulled by adults to haul 40-pound feed bags, load trucks, carry construction supplies. No one asked whether the boy wanted it. They just looked at his size and decided to put it to good use. What he truly wanted, no one knew. At 12, Dan was placed in the middle of O'Donnell's Main Street every Saturday night to box grown men for the town's entertainment. People cheered him on, calling him the kid who doesn't feel pain, the winning machine. Dan always won, because he had to. A 1.83-meter, 200-pound child was not allowed to lose. Losing meant disappointing the town's expectations he never agreed to shoulder. Dirk said a sentence that left everyone silent. "My father wasn't raised like a child, but like a legend in the making." But no legend is created without cost. In exchange for strength, Dan lost the right to be weak. In exchange for admiration, he lost the right to be afraid. In exchange for image, he lost the right to simply be human. When you're 6 and everyone demands to see how strong you are, when you're 13 and grown men fear you, you quickly learn a harsh lesson. You're not allowed to be weak, even if you're just a trembling child. Dirk said his father rarely spoke about his childhood, but whenever he did, he said just one thing: "I don't remember ever being allowed to be small." And that heavy mold, the strongest boy in town, the Texas giant, followed Dan Blocker for life. It followed him onto the football field, into the military, into Hollywood, and finally into the role of Hoss Cartwright. Even Hoss was just another version of the big, gentle, strong giant Dan could never escape. 3. He wanted to be a professor, not a TV star. If there is one thing that pains Dirk the most when he looks back on his father's life, it is that the whole world always believed Dan Blocker was born to stand in front of a camera. People saw the massive frame, the warm smile, the half-rancher, half-cowboy walk, and simply assumed, this is a natural-born TV star. But the truth points in the exact opposite direction. According to Dirk, Dan Blocker was the kind of man who, if you gave him a classroom full of students and an old wooden lectern, would be 100 times happier than under the glare of 10 cameras. Dan Blocker always preferred knowledge to attention. After leaving the Korean battlefield, he went back to university on GI Bill money, not to start a new life in Hollywood, but to pick up what he had loved even before the war: education.